Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. Today is Sunday, the 23rd of February, 2020. And what we're going to talk about in this episode is mostly Japan. And you guys are going to find out the reason why as I get going. So without further ado, let's begin. Let's start the charts right here and take a look now today at this new disease spreading in the world, and we see 78,891 confirmed cases, mostly in mainland China, 76,936, 634 others, 602 in South Korea, 135 in Japan, 132 in Italy, 89 in Singapore. Now, the reason why I want to talk about Japan is right now Japan is at 135. Okay? When you see with this disease, what I've been noting is when you see cases of this disease seems to have an undersurface where what you can't see. So it's like everywhere it goes, it's like the tip of the iceberg, what you're seeing, the cases you're seeing, compared to the amount of other cases that would be underlying that are going undetected, because this disease has something called, has a long incubation period, and it also has something called asymptomatic transmission. Okay? Basically what that means is the person's not ill. They're not ill. Now, to what degree of asymptomatic transmission does it have? This has been undetermined yet, but how much asymptomatic transmission it has, but the person's not ill. This is the point. And this iceberg is the people that are asymptomatic. That's the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is the cases you see that have been detected. So if you see 135 cases in Japan that have been detected, how many asymptomatic cases are there in Japan that are going undetected? Now, this is a point. Now, the next point I want to make about this disease is social order, supply line distribution. Doesn't just involve things for like machinery and parts and things like that. That's what people think when they think supply lines are now being cut and supply side distribution is being cut. The first thing people think of is things like automobiles, manufacturing products, and so on. It's not just limited to auto manufacturing products and such. It can also include supply side distribution for things that you use on an everyday basis. Things like you want to cook your dinner. Say you're going to make spaghetti and you want spaghetti noodles. Supply side distribution could be cut, on things like that as well. So what we're looking at here is a rapidly spreading disease that is, once it gets a toehold in a particular country and it gets all of these asymptomatic people that are asymptomatic that have the disease that don't know they have the disease, once it gets hold in the communities and starts to spread from person to person, it's awfully hard to root out of a country at that point in time. Once it gets beyond a certain point where they can't test all the people that could be asymptomatic and so on, it starts to get extremely difficult to root it out of a country. Now, Japan is at that kind of getting at that threshold. And why I want to pick on Japan and talk about it is there's a social order that's been established in the world now for the last 7,000 years. It come from the line of kings and rulership, and now it's came to governments, and governments rule the world. If that social order, the integrity of that that's been built over 7,000 years, if all of a sudden something comes along that breaks that and society breaks down into its elemental parts, in other words, every man for himself, because something's come along and broke down that social order, then it's awfully hard to restore that social order once it's broken down. To restore order and to restore law and so on once it breaks down, because it's something that was built over a long period of time, over like 7,000 years, like I say, to our day. And once the social order breaks down, now what is Japan going to do? Japan's got this disease coming in. Why I'm focusing on Japan is a specific reason. I'm going to tell you guys what it is. In the United States right now, the elderly represents about 14% of the population. In China, where this disease is struck first, the elderly only represent about 9% of the population, which is very low. So most of the people are young. Demographics would come into play with this disease. And what I mean by that is the higher percentage you have of elderly, the higher the mortality rate is going to be for this disease. So basically it works like this. If you had a country where everybody was over 90 years old, every single person, that disease would get struck, and this disease moves through that country, the mortality rate would be much higher than if you had another country where everybody was under 20. The mortality rate would be extremely low. This is an extreme example of what I'm talking about. But what we're looking at is Japan has like 24% of the population is like over 65 and elderly. They're old. A high percentage of the population, probably higher than most countries. In fact, it's nearly double what it is in the United States, and it's about 3 times what it is in China. There's like 3 times more elderly in China. There's a lot of people in Japan. I think it's like 109 million people in Japan. Take Tokyo and surrounding area. You know how big city Tokyo is. I mean, it's just absolutely massive. And so Japan could get hit really, really hard with this virus, to the extent that the social order in Japan would be threatened. In other words, not just supply side distribution, but the whole social order could be threatened. Now, at this point in time, Japan it says 135 people have this virus in Japan. And, at this point in time, maybe if they were to really crack down hard, they might be able to eliminate it from their country. I think it's it would be a very good thing if they could do that, if it's possible. But it would take an extreme effort on the part of the Japanese people to eliminate, but it would be worth it. It would be worth it compared to what's coming if they don't get it under control in Japan. Because of the high demographic of elderly in Japan. And so let's talk about what if, because I've watched all week and I've seen the numbers creeping up higher and higher in Japan. So we're going to make the assumption that they're not able to make that turnaround, and it spreads through Japan. How would Japan keep its social order in place? In other words, keep from going into total anarchy. And I'm going to explain it to you now. There's 4 parts to this that the government would need to concentrate on in order to maintain control and keep anarchy from happening. 4 basic parts to this. And I'm going to list them in most important to least important. But all 4 aspects are all important. They're all important. The first aspect that has to stay in place in order to maintain control is food distribution lines. Bringing food into the affected areas. is the most important thing. And if that breaks down, then the social order will break down because the people will start to starve. That's number one. Number two is distribution of that food, making sure it gets into the hands of the people. That's number two. Second most important. So those two aspects work together, hand in hand. One, food supply chains, and two, distribution of said food to the people to keep them from starving. That's number one and two, and those two things are most important to maintaining order and control, and so that anarchy doesn't rule. Number three is power. The power grid has to stay up and running. Next to food, that's second important, that the power grid stays up and running. Number four is communication networks have to stay up and running. So if you can keep those four things going, if you can keep the power going, if you can keep food distribution going, if you can keep food networks open, and if you can keep the fourth thing going, which is exchange of information, in other words, the internet. If you can keep those four things going, the populace of a country can go through a tremendous upheaval and still order is maintained. The police forces will still function. Everything will still function within the country, even though they're going through a tremendous, absolutely horrendous crisis. Order can still be maintained. But if you let those four, this is where the government needs to focus. They need to focus on these four things, and in that short period of time, and they can use currency to supplement those four things that they're focusing on. In other words, if they're going to do any sort of stimulus measures, those stimulus measures should be focused on keeping those four things up and running through the crisis and beyond, until the people get back on their feet, until the people start to recover and become so that there's a lot more recovered than there are sick. At a certain point, society will start to run itself again, and the society will recover from even something as bad as this. If you keep those four parts of four things running, but if you let those things go and you focus on other things, and you let those four things disintegrate, then you'll see the social order will break down at that point, and then you've got a bigger problem, a much wider spread, bigger problem. And what'll happen then, if you let the social order decay, we're going to go in and talk about that now. What happens if you let the social order decay and you get to the point of the whole thing is melted down? What'll happen is a new social order will spring up rather rapidly, all on its own. And that new social order will go about purging the old social order. And, they will want to, they'll want to appease the people. And the people at that point would be, well, it's not a pretty situation. And the new social order that would spring up would want to appease the people, and the people would want other people to be held responsible for what happened. This is just the way it works. So this is the way this is moving, and this talk to you guys. I don't want to see anything like this happen. I want to see Japan. I want to see these numbers go down instead of up. But all I've been seeing, so we have to discuss what if, and what will be the ramifications and repercussions if that does happen. And because this situation looks like it's moving in that direction, I had to discuss what would happen in this kind of a situation. Thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.